The following content has been provided by RWTH Aachen University.
This is the overview that I gave you last time, evaluating without users, evaluating with users. A couple techniques here that we covered. We'll get to GOMs and those kinds of things in more detail today. And then we'll talk about a few qualitative and quantitative techniques to evaluate with users. And there's always, of course, interviews, questionnaires that you can run alongside that, but those don't necessarily require a prototype to be around. You could ask other things even without having a prototype. That's why we keep them outside this tree. So, want to wrap up with retrospective testing in the area of qualitative studies with users around. The idea is that this is an activity that you do in addition to a user test. So basically, you do what you mentioned earlier. You record, you capture video, you capture some kind of way of what happened during the interaction. And then after that, you sit down with the user and you go over the video together. This is a nice combination. That means that during the experiment, the user doesn't have to talk. So it doesn't feel weird to talk to the thin air around you. You don't get distracted by having to talk about what you do. You really just do. And then right after that, when the experience is still fresh in the user's mind and memory, you go over the video recording with them, and you say, "So why did you press that button? Oh, or why did you never try that option? Oh, I don't know, I didn't see it. Why don't you make it look like a button?" So you have a discussion with the user, and you as the sort of person who's running the experiment about the experience that the user just had. This is nice because you can stop the video, you can go back. Of course, it takes time, right? So it's more time intensive than just doing things while the user is using the system. But it gives you a great starting point to start asking for questions or suggestions for improvements, to resolve questions. It also, doing it right after the user used the system avoids their memory getting falsified and changed. So this sort of correction or this avoiding the false memory thing is important because oftentimes when you ask people long after they've used the system, they forget about all the problems they had. You forget about them because they were dead ends. You didn't get anywhere, so you erase it from memory and you continue on. But if you go back and see the video, you can show the person that they picked the wrong option or that they hovered over a button before they picked something else. You can show that something happened there, and they can explain what was going on. So this leads naturally to the question, okay, I'm going over a recording. How do I make those? What do I need to be aware of when I capture what's happening during a user test? The easiest way to capture is what we talked about earlier, paper and pencil. Right? So you can just write down what happens. This basically means user is doing something, evaluator sits next to them and makes notes. You write down what happens. You write down how interpretations of the user are, or what your interpretations of what you're observing are. So you see the user trying to click a button that's grayed out. You make a note. Seems like it's not clear what kind of options are disabled in the system. Those kinds of things. That's cheap, paper, pencil. But it's hard to do, especially in real time, with trying to capture many details. Because writing is just slow, compared to what's happening in the real world. You'll quickly find yourself falling behind in trying to capture all that's going on. Especially since you're basically writing on a blank piece of paper. So you can help with this in some way if you have forms. If you say, you have pre-printed forms that you take for each observation. You use a little form sheet where you say what kind of aspect you're looking at, what kind of interface element maybe created the problem, what you observed, those kinds of things, what the task was at the time. But it's hard. I mean, you still want to capture written notes anytime you do a user study, simply to structure and have a mental sort of record of what happened. But usually you want to support this with some kind of capture. So audio, or ideally audio plus video. If you can capture just the audio, that's already good if you have think aloud or constructive interaction going on. because you want to capture, of course, the speech of the person, what they're saying. The difficulty is, here you are, you've got your iPhone, you recorded 30 minutes of audio, and what does that mean? If you don't have a video capture of what actually went on, the user says something like, oh, it looks like this button isn't working, and you're like, well, what button, right? So just the audio is often not very helpful because you can't connect it to the UI state, like what the user was actually doing when they said this thing. So that's why video is really the ideal thing. If you can at all, then you want to capture two images. You want to capture what's going on the screen, if there's some kind of graphical interface, whether it's a mobile device, whether it's a desktop, whether it's a laptop, whatever, even a smartwatch. You want to capture what's going on the screen. So you have a screen capture in some way. Some systems allow you to record screens digitally. This is great. In other cases, you need to actually point a camera at the screen and kind of capture it in an analog way. That's also OK. Make sure you can still see what's going on. And you want to capture, and this might be less obvious, the user's expression, like the face, basically, because that allows you to then connect the speech to certain gestures, mimics. You can interpret better what their emotional state was using. Were they confused? Were they annoyed by the system? Or were they just making a joke at some point? So capturing the user and the system is ideal. Sometimes it's important to capture the user's hands as well. You want to maybe see what he's doing with the mouse when he's clicking, or capture what's going on the keyboard. Those kinds of things might be important too. So having this kind of capture is obviously ideal. Make sure you get stuff synchronized. So again, having a screen recording and having a user talk, if you don't have some kind of way of synchronizing those two down to like half a second or so, then again you're in trouble because you will have a hard time finding out exactly where stuff began and ended. So just create some kind of classic clap or something that makes sure that you can get your track synchronized, or use some other way of doing that. This is, of course, the best way of doing this, but it could be intrusive. So if you say, oh, would you please use this mobile app here, and by the way, we're going to point cameras at your face and over your shoulder at the smartphone you're holding, and a third one on your hands and whatever, people might get a little uncomfortable. Depends. Some people are completely fine with this. Others get very nervous. So be aware that this is sort of more intrusive than the other capture methods when you just write down some notes. If you do the video recording, still make written notes. Because the written notes you make, you want to then make just very short marks, like say 1 minute 30 into the experiment, user stumbles over menu selection or something, right? And then this is a perfect index into your video, because the video is going to be long and mostly boring. There's going to be some things that go wrong that you want to capture, that you want to get to, but those are hard to find. So if you use the time during the experiment to just make yourself a little index into your video, that will be very useful later on when you get to review it. There are sometimes dedicated tools for doing this, capturing these kinds of things. For example, a tool that we saw a couple years ago, it's currently in a new release beta phase, so you can't use it right now. I think you can download an older version. It's called Silverback. It was written by a guy who was a UX designer. It's a small tool, nothing big. But it did things very nicely. It captured sort of the video of the laptop camera, looking back at the user, and it put that as picture-in-picture with a screenshot of, a screen recording of the user interface. It also would actually create automatically things like video renderings of text. Let's say like Command K has been pressed if the user pressed a certain keyboard combination. So you could actually basically have everything in one nice recorded video. Take a look maybe at the website for Silverback to get an idea of what kind of tools you might want to look for when you need to do this yourself. I'm going to show you a different tool because once you've recorded your observations, you'll have to go over them. And I already mentioned that indexing them and making sure they're synchronized is very important. And it's surprisingly difficult to make sense of these different streams of data unless you can really see them side by side. Our friends and colleagues at the University of California in San Diego recently developed a tool called ChronoViz as part of a research project that actually works surprisingly well and that does a lot of things right. So I'm showing you, I'm going to show you a little video of ChronoViz for two reasons. First of all, it's an example of a tool you can actually download and use for free and play with, and we've used it in our own lab studies here. We know the folks at UCSD who developed it, so if there's a problem, we can bug them about it. But also as maybe an example of the kind of tools, the family of tools you might want to look for if you need to do user studies. So I'm going to show you this short 2-minute video here.
Chrono.
Okay, so the video, if you're interested in this, goes on to explain more about the technical details of the tool. You can go to chronoviz.com, I think it is, to find out more about this. Like I said, it's a free research tool, and I invite you to take a look at this. I think this also showed that video analysis is actually a tricky thing to do. We talk about the process of coding a video, which basically means you go through the video and you look for the things happening and you write them down as text. Person 1 turns their head to person 2. Person 2 acknowledges what person 1 said. Those kinds of things often are necessary to understand exactly what happened in the user session.
This content was provided by RWTH Aachen University.